Hello and welcome to the webinar today. We are so excited to have you here as part of our Pathlock Innovation Series. This is our first session titled How Serco Transformed Their SAP Controls Monitoring Through User Intelligence. Our presenter today will be Gerald West, Head of Application Security and Controls Assurance with Serco.
And hello, everyone, and welcome to this session. I am going to be talking about a methodology called user intelligence, and it is really something that is similar to business intelligence. So in the same way as business intelligence has transformed business processes and transactions and given insight and on how businesses can make decisions, what we are doing with user intelligence is trying to effectively do the same thing around the topics of users, security, and controls in general. But before I do that, I would like to just ask a question. And if you can put your ideas in the chat and think about it throughout the course, I'll do a bit of a reveal at the end of the presentation. So one of the things that we're all very much invested in is protecting the value of the SAP asset that we've actually bought and using to drive business benefit. And we've come up with an acronym called the CURE. So what I would like you to ask is, how do we protect the value? And think of four drivers which map to these to the acronym CURE. Something to keep bubbling in your minds as we go through the presentation. So I head up application security and controls assurance at Serco, and I've been working with SAP for over 25 years. And during that time, I've had a variety of roles, but they've all been related to protecting SAP value in some way. So what I'm going to cover today is controls monitoring is the first part of the main thrust of this presentation. And then I'll dive into the concept of user intelligence. I have a lot of examples that I will touch on. I won't spend as much time on those slides. I'll try and just give you a bit of a feel for what the art of the possible is with user intelligence. And hopefully that will inspire some of you to try out the methodology yourselves and get some of the benefits. And then we'll talk about benefits and roadmap as well at the end. Right, so let me just introduce Serco provides outsourcing services to governments and public sector organizations across a range of sectors from defense to transport. We operate in the UK, North America, ASPAC, Middle East, and Europe. We've been running SAP since 2007. We have most of the main SAP components. We're on a journey to S/4HANA like most other companies as well. And we have over 40,000 SAP users. In terms of our controls approach, people, process, technology, right at the heart of this, but we also focus on data because what we've come to recognize is that your controls are only as good as your data, ultimately. And so we enable the controls environment by trying to be as clear as possible around process and policy, ensuring we have the right people empowered and engaged to do the right thing, and making it easier to do the right thing, and also being very clear about what the risks are and how the control mechanisms address these risks. So once we've enabled the environment, then we can implement and maintain effective controls, test that they are indeed effective, and make sure we have the reporting capability to flash up any exceptions. And just further on that controls approach, we use a number of levers. Change control is a general lever that's used across the board to manage the risk of changes. But user access, settings and configuration, programs and software, those are the main levers that most of us controls professionals tend to use in one way or another to manage our risk areas and help prevent, detect, and respond to the bad things that could happen from a system or process perspective. And we have a methodology that then supports all of this. But the ultimate game plan is system, process, and data integrity. And we always have to think about people, process, technology, and data. So hopefully this sort of sets the scene. How do we actually do this? We have a controls platform technologically. In terms of the technology stack, we have a controls platform which is very much has our GRC component at its center, which is Pathlock in our case. We actually invested in Security Weaver at the time in 2010. It's been recently become part of a bigger outfit called Pathlock, which gives a really exciting end-to-end capability across the piece. This GRC component interacts with standard SAP components to give us that overall controls platform. And if we look a bit closer at what we have from a Pathlock native or Security Weaver perspective, where separations enforcer is how we do our risk analysis, whether it's critical access risk or combinations of access with segregation of duties risk, or indeed access to data, whether it's just sensitive data, personal data, or organizational scope. That we use separations enforcer very extensively to cover any of these access related topics. And then we extend our reach into non-SAP or non-ABAP, more precisely, areas by using Secure Enterprise. Now we know that there is a very exciting development within Pathlock called Pathlock Bridge, which is really a game changer in this space. So we're very interested and excited about looking into this area going forward as well. And that's the next sort of evolution of this. Emergency repair, that allows us to look after our privileged access management and exceptional access as well. And we use that very heavily. Process auditor is the wicket keeper, if you like, for managing master data checks, configuration and settings, transaction monitoring, a whole host of areas. Anything that you can actually define, you can do with process auditor. And then, of course, the one that's usually everyone's favorite, transaction archive. That's what we call Big Brother on steroids. And I'm not going to say too much about this because I just want to point you towards a great presentation tomorrow by one of the exponents of Transaction Archive. Richard Butt is from Linklaters is presenting tomorrow, so please look out for his presentation tomorrow afternoon. And if we then move on, we've got license management. That's another tool we use, and reset password. This is a great utility, very popular with the end users that we also have. We're also in the process of expanding our portfolio in Pathlock as well. So that's our portfolio of technology. So let's just talk a little bit about controls monitoring. So even before we have any specialist tools, even with just basic SAP, you can set up detective controls to ensure the right things happen and the wrong things don't. And that's simply by establishing visibility, by establishing reporting on the relevant data set that relates to what you're trying to control. And then once you have that report, you can define an exception scenario. Something's wrong. You can define that using a variant and capture that using a variant, and then automate the alerting capability by simply running the batch job, running that program with a batch job for that variant and sending it to the appropriate distribution list. And that's how we have that controls monitoring 101 scenario. And whether we're looking at standard SAP or we're looking at the most sophisticated Pathlock mechanism, it's still fundamentally we're reporting, we send out an alert, someone then investigates and checks the scenario, and then takes the required corrective action. So this, what we call this race methodology, is embedded in controls monitoring across the board. And actually, it provides a lot of effectiveness around controls. But is it enough? And there are questions that we can ask around monitoring. So how do we choose what to monitor? How do we know we're monitoring all the important things? Are the different organizations, is it all equal across the organization? Are there areas where we need to check compliance a bit more carefully? And really, ultimately, how do we know what is actually going on in our SAP systems? So it all boils down to the level of awareness, and of course, awareness increases the choice. So this is how monitoring and analytics have to play well together. And so let's just have a little look at analytics. So analytics relies on creating context, and then that context then allows us to generate insights and highlight exceptions. So to give you an example, if we think of a user executing a transaction code from a particular terminal ID, maybe on a particular day, that data set, that piece of data may not be particularly meaningful. unless you know a lot about the user, or you know much about the transaction, or indeed you know much about the terminal. But if you did and you had the right context, that might actually translate into an organization performing a specific business process using a particular method of access, and possibly on a particular day of the week, if that's relevant. Yeah, you start to get a level of context that generates insight. So, these discoveries can help us then either uh, action specific items, or indeed refine our monitoring. So actually feed back into monitoring and say, well, actually, we need to now start monitoring this because we've discovered via our dashboard that this is an important thing to track. And then we set up the monitoring, the race methodology to track that. And that's how controls monitoring gets transformed. We discover through the context and insights that we get from analytics. So that brings us on to the more specific element of user intelligence. Now, users are the heart of everything pretty much that happens on our SAP system. And so if we have context that is very much at the level of user, if we actually enrich the context around the user, we are able to then start to get better insights into whatever happens and is driven by a user. So whether it's the attributes, the capabilities, or the activities of the user will bring more meaning to whatever we are looking at. So there are three questions that we pose when we talk about user intelligence. The first question is, who are the users and what is their context? The second is, what can the users actually do? And the third is, what have they done? And those three are the fundamental questions of user intelligence. So if we look at the first one, who are the users and what's their context? Well, typically one of the key elements is organizational context, because that's really what then gives a lot. But there are other forms of context, the user type, there are other things about the status of the user. And if you then plug into the employee, the HR connection between the user and the employee record, you then have access to more information about the person. So you do get to increase the level of context you can generate around the user. Then next question, what can the users do? And here, probably just highlight two of these. There's assigned access is just the facts of what access people have got, what roles are assigned to the users and what's in the roles, what authorizations are in the roles. So that's almost the factual perspective. The evaluated access is a slightly different lens. It's looking at the access through the lens of risk effectively, as described by, for example, separations enforcer that will, via one of or more of its rule sets, describe segregation of duty risk, or critical authorizations risk, or access to data. But that's evaluated within the tool. And both of these perspectives very, very, very useful. And there are a number of other things that we can do, but I'm just going to focus on these first two. The third question is, and that's the one that often gets people more excited, is what have the users done? And whether it's just the simple transaction history that they've performed, what transactions they've run, what programs they've executed, or their log-on activities, whether, how they're logging on exactly, what sort of errors they're getting from which terminals, and what does that mean in terms of what method of access or where they're coming from. What have they actually done events-wise, downloads, changes, debug. There are a whole range of activities that can be looked at. So then we come on to the question of how do we actually do this? So we use a standard analytics approach of, we extract data, standardize, collate, analyze, present, and evolve it. In terms of our data sources, it'll be a lot of it will be from Pathlock modules. We have a number of modules, and we will be harvesting data. One of the advantages of Pathlock and the Pathlock native is that the information is embedded in SAP, so you have transparent tables that you can interrogate, which means you have almost unlimited reporting capability against the Pathlock data, which is very, very powerful. And of course, you can get information from SAP tables as well, and reports, and indeed the audit log, which is actually integrated with one of the Pathlock modules, Transaction Archive. In terms of data analysis tools, we started off using Microsoft Excel, and that's a very good place to start. to play with some of these taxonomies and get some insight from some of this data. But very quickly we graduated on to Power BI, which gives us more scale and firepower around analytics. And that's been a great way for us to rapidly discover the value and the use cases that we can drive insight from. But of course, the ultimate roadmap is to select some of these use cases and implement them in SAP using SAP BW and SAP Analytics Cloud to have a more real-time capability in the analytics space. So that's really the game plan around this. Right. These are just some example use cases. I've just literally a little sample. I'm not going to dwell too long, but some of the things we've seen is around, safeguarding remediation of user access. That's one of the easy wins in this space. The firefighter, refining and optimizing the firefighter concept has been really great. You get great visibility of what's going on. And then detecting, the obvious breaches and having the organizational context to make sense of those events that are happening. That's been really useful as well. So those are just a few examples. What I want to do is drill down a bit more into examples here. But before I go into the use cases, I'll just give examples of taxonomies, because the taxonomies are the lifeblood of user intelligence. So the most important taxonomy in user intelligence is the user list, and we have a very extensive user master data record, which is then extended by linking to the employee record and anything else that will give it the richness that feeds into analytics. One of the fields in the user list is the user group, and this taxonomy we're showing on the screen is the user group taxonomy, which is a way of extending the user group concept to even drive more insight. So we have a user group description, but then we have a user group type, which we then map to that user group. So that user group is classified. So is it an end user group, or is it for SAP support users, or does it involve service desk users, or the shared service users? And that gives a certain context for the user. And then we look at the user group category and subcategory. These can then just be simple organizational structure type plays. So it could represent division and business unit or equivalent effectively. And again, you have that simple classification, and you can make this as comprehensive as you like. What we've found is that even with a fairly simple taxonomy, we get enormous benefit from the user group. And actually, it's inviting us to make our user groups more granular, because we can actually get a lot more value out of the user group field. So this is just one example of one field from the user master. I'll pick something else, and this comes from the firefighter use case, where we wanted to create a taxonomy around the firefighter roles, the emergency roles. So again, you've got the emergency role, you've got the description that you get out of the system, but then we map a role category, and that is a description of the type of activity effectively that the role provides. So whether it's system administration, or is transaction processing, or is it indeed master data management, or mass data management. So we've got a few activity types that we feel are relevant, and we've categorized in that way. But we also talk about the domain. The domain is more to do with the process or responsibility area. Is it P2P? Is it orders to cash? Is it record to report? Is it HR? Is it payroll? Is it security? Is it basis? So it's a mix of business process areas as well as other technical areas. So we've sort of amalgamated them into the concept of domain. And then the role type is another way for housekeeping, really. So is it a firefighter role? Is it a dedicated firefighter role? Or is it a temporary role? Is it a business end user role? Or is it indeed a third party role? So this allows us to manage the types of roles that are playing in the emergency repair tool. And then the last couple of fields, as an example, is how specific the role is. And we prefer roles that are firefighter roles that are very high in terms of how specific they are, because then that focuses the privileged access, and the intervention is very, very focused. But there are some roles which may be a little bit broader, and so we reflect that. So that gives us the ability to then manage this over time. But the most important of all these attributes of the role is the risk. So being able to tag a firefighter role with a risk level means that we can use that to drive a whole range of actions. So whether it's the SLA around review of the role, or whether it's how we assign the role and how we treat how we actually manage the whole action around the role is key. Okay, so that's another example. And just one more example is transactions. So this is the transaction codes. So again, we've got the transaction code, we've got the description. Again, we have a category. So is it a business transaction? Is it master data transaction? Is it controls management? Is it data modeling? We've got a whole range of different categories that we've categorized the transactions into. And similarly, we have a domain. So we can have conversations with the various process owners. So they look at P2P or R2R or O2C, etc. But then we also have a number of other fields like capability. Now we could have kept it simple, and you can maintain and display. That might be enough. That might be good enough. But we've explored a bit further. What about upload? Maybe transfer, which is slightly different from maintain. That's moving something from one place to another. And we're experimenting with a number of different capabilities which provide the potential for insight that we may not have otherwise. So that's something, the capability of the core capability of the transaction is another attribute to maintain. Obviously, risk is key. So how risky fundamentally is this transaction? And we've got a risk rating there. And then something to do with the type of transaction, is it standard SAP? Is it third party? Is it custom code? Is it, and exactly what the component is? Is it a security weaver technology? Is it biz apps? Whatever we've got. And then we have a number of other areas around criticality. So criticality is how critical is this transaction? If it were out of action, how much of an impact would that have on the business process? So how crucial is this transaction for the business process? And then we have the phase of the overall business process as well. Okay, so hopefully this gives you a reasonably good view of the taxonomies that then provide context, which fuels the whole user intelligence process. I'm going to now run through a number of examples in terms of case studies where we've applied this. So the first dashboard that we really dived into was the firefighter one. So I'm just going to run through. I'm not going to dwell too much on the detail because there's just far too much to cover. But I want to give you a bit of a taste of what this leads to. So if we talk about the emergency repair process, I think we're probably all familiar with this. So we don't want to provide access because it's risky on an ongoing basis. So we provide it for a limited time using the firefighter mechanism where the user will self-provision the role. And then during the time they have the role, effectively everything they do is recorded, and somebody needs to review that detail and sign off at the end of the session when the role is removed. So that process is well established and it's heavily used. But what we've found is that we can get so much more out of this by having the analytics oversight over the process. But before I go into that, just to look at the use cases, SAP IT support is one of the key areas where people may be performing what might seem routine IT support activities, but actually they pose a level of risk to the production system, and we prefer to wrap them in the controlled wrapper of the firefighter mechanism. So again, it will vary from company to company, but it is an available option to secure some of the IT support. We also find that business continuity, that it's really been a very useful mechanism to extend the business continuity capabilities around. If you have an outsourced environment, then retaining some capability within the company via the firefighter mechanism ensures that you have a level of resilience in the event that something goes wrong with the provider, as an example. And we had this, very much in focus at the beginning of the pandemic, where it wasn't clear how things were going to unfold, and that's where this really sort of took off in a major way. The other thing is around remediation and providing, again, a level of mitigation around some of the conflicts that might be left in place because of the size of teams or things like that. So there are a lot of use cases for the firefighter concept. In terms of how we implement the user intelligence dashboard, there are 6 sources of firefighter data, of emergency repair data. The sessions themselves, the master data, so that's the assignments of users to the firefighter roles, and the reviewers and approvers that are assigned to that as well. And then the changes to that master data. And then, of course, you've got the activity information, whether transaction usage, program usage, debugging. And all of this is then supported by a range of taxonomies, which provide the context and insight: users, roles, transactions, programs, and even we have a feed from our ServiceNow system, which is all the tickets. So every firefighter session typically will have a ServiceNow ticket reference, which then contains all the detail of the approvals, the justification, the context for the actual intervention in the first place. So I'm going to give you a few snapshots of what the data can look like. So this is based on reasonably realistic, but we've obviously tweaked some of the information but we're still giving you a realistic feel for what it would look like. And what you have is the metrics going across the top will be reference metrics like the number of users, the number of sessions, the number of firefighter user groups, number of reviewers and reviewer user groups, number of roles, number of tickets that have been involved, and the number of days, different days that we've had activity on. And you can move the time slicer across to look at different time ranges. And then, of course, what we typically have is actionable metrics going down on the left, which, how many unreviewed sessions do we have? What's the average review day? So the amount of time to review sessions is important. And then actually, if we look at one of the relationships, which is around the average review days by month, we have a role risk legend, which then means that we can actually look at it by role risk. And that actually is an example of where we can tailor the policy, or indeed the SLA, to then align with the risk level. And that's one of the things that we're very interested in and hoping to see more provision for within the tools. And I think that's already something that's Pathlock team are looking to enable customers to maintain their role risk, for example, within Pathlock, which then enables us to have tailor-made policies around review, for example. Late reviews is another metric, so if how many reviews were done after the default due date, for example. So we have a number of these, and then you could have a policy around what constitutes a breach. Is it 30 days? At what point do you say this is not acceptable? And that's a different level from just being late. So you have a lot of options, again, based on the taxonomy, whether it's roles or domains. If a process owner is interested in what's happening within their area, there might be the R2R process owner. They would then drill in through here and drill down to various levels of detail to look at who's been running firefighter sessions, what have they been doing, etc. And of course, you can filter the entire dashboard, using any of these taxonomy, again, leveraging taxonomies to get different levels of insight and perspectives on the data. I'll just rush through this. Again, the master data dashboard, this is all about the assignments. If we look on the left, it's really the key ones, probably expired reviewers. So again, a bit of housekeeping, so all of this, it tracks. I won't go through all the details, but again, hopefully this forms an impression. In general, can I just ask if anything catches your eye and you would really like to know more, just make a note of it, and you can ask me at the end. Changes, similarly, these are the changes to the firefighter assignments. The one that usually catches our eye is the self changes. So, if someone's maintaining ER and they have maintained their own record in some way, shape, or form, whether setting themselves up as a firefighter or indeed as a reviewer or approver, it's something that shows up here. And we know that, oh, right, their record was involved in something they were maintaining. And then we just need to follow up to make sure that we're happy with the governance around that whole piece. So those are just examples of some of the insights that we can get from this. And then in terms of activity, this leverages the transaction taxonomy that we talked about. So we can look at activity type. So if we're interested in is anyone performing firefighter activities that involve uploading or mass maintenance or any other activity type or transaction code capability that we maintain in the taxonomy? We can actually look at that directly from here. And that's the advantage. This is a clear illustration of where the taxonomy provides benefit. But yeah, you can look at it by system, by month. So the more sort of obvious things are catered for, but some of the exploiting of the taxonomies also is very much evident here. So we could have one of the process owners might pick their process and drill in and see the top transactions that have been executed, and then they could drill further in and see which organizations have been executing that, and then ask some interesting questions about why that's been happening, and ultimately drill down into the ServiceNow ticket that related to their to the action that was performed. Yeah, so the programs dashboard is pretty similar as well. And then we have a dashboard around debugging. We actually worked with our ABAP team to classify the debug activity scenarios, so that again, rather than have just the detailed message IDs and debug types that we were seeing in the raw information, but to try and categorize them so that we get a little bit more insight into what's happening. So that's something that we'll continue refining as we go through. I'm not going to dwell too long on user activity analytics because I'm very keen to get to the third case study, but I'll just show you some of the key screenshots. Just the basic headline is that the data comes from Transaction Archive primarily. There is some that will also come from the security audit log, whether directly or through Transaction Archive. And we have a number of taxonomies that support the analysis. So I'll just point out the terminal taxonomy is an interesting one because we have, we link each terminal ID to a method of access. It's either directly through the Windows GUI, or it's through Citrix or virtual desktop, so it's coming slightly indirectly, or it's through some sort of web interface. So it's a web dispatcher effectively, and that's either to do with a Fiori interaction or some other web app that is going. So we have a number of bits of insight that can be gained. So if we look at the one example, so this is just a transaction dashboard overview. So it just gives you an overview of what's happening. Again, full drill down, filtering, all of that capabilities there. Just again, it's going to leave an impression rather than dive into the detail. So you have all the benefits of having the taxonomy. We can look at it by transaction code risk, by the activity type or the capability. We can look at it by the criticality. We can look at it by the category, etc. And then drill into the detail, or we can look at it by time of day. So if we're looking for patterns, day of the week, is there stuff happening on Sundays? Is there high risk stuff happening on the weekend? That sort of thing. We have all that capability. And this is something that often is very popular with our business stakeholders, where they get some stats on where the volume of transaction code execution is happening, what the most used transactions are, and how many people, and then they drill into which organizations are using them, and you get some occasionally a few surprises pop up, which is always good because it shows that's insight. Yeah, you have, this is just one example, the first step, and then of course, then you can drill down further into the detail. Right, this is where I slow down a little bit because I've been sort of scrambling to get to this point. I've chosen the user access dashboard as the one case study that I will dwell on a little bit more, simply because it's the one that I think most people can relate to, and is one that most people would use because it's often the starting point of your controls journey. And it's all about who access. So if we look at the methods and data here, so the core data sources will be around, so in terms of assigned access, it will just be the user role tables. We can get stuff out of SAP. There are lots of different reports that can provide that information. In terms of evaluated access, it will be typically from Pathlock, Separations Enforcer. And then we then support all our access. When you ask the question, what access does the user have? The very next question is, what have they done? And so we often have Transaction Archive as the first level, what we call the level 1 activity, which is about transaction code execution. But then we often go to what we call level 2 activity, which is document creation or update. So that's where what have they actually done from a document perspective. And in the case of finance postings, BKPF is a great source of the truth of what is actually happening from a finance posting perspective. So that's just one example. As usual, we have the supporting taxonomies to provide that context. So just some example dashboards. So if we look at the first one, and before I go into this, let's just, one of the things we've discovered, and one of the challenges that we have, those of us who are in the SAP security space, is if you're trying to, especially if you have a fairly complex environment, if you're trying to review user access with non-experts, or rather business users who are not necessarily close to the detail of what roles and authorizations you've set up, it can be fairly complicated to do that, and you often lose people when you get into the detail of the various roles, especially if you have a highly complex environment. But one of the things that Separation Enforcer allows us to do is simplify this conversation radically, because the building blocks that we find in the rule set. So if you take the SOD rule set, the building blocks of SODs are the functions, and the individual functions are effectively descriptions of access, units of access, currency of access. And so if you make your functions granular enough that it serves your purpose, and that's what we found by actually specifying, creating functions that represent the building blocks of access, the permissions effectively that people have to do finite business things. That's something that we found particularly useful. So if we look at this dashboard, we've got the functions describing the access that people have got, and then the conflicts can then be describing the risk around the access that people have got. So if we look at this, you have the system, the rule set, the domain, which again is part of the taxonomy around the functions. So we know which functions belong to which domains. The function ID, the function description, and then the sensitivity. So again, risk level of the function in itself, the owner, and then we have a couple of metrics, the number of users who have that function, and the number of user groups that have that function as well. And then we've got a number of slicers that can support, including a slicer around the rule sets. And we've got a bit of a taxonomy around the rule sets just to help make them more meaningful to use. And if I can illustrate that, so if we just do a drop down on the rule sets theme, so rather than again present the detailed rule set 004 or the rule set 999, which would mean very little to the stakeholders, especially if you're looking at multiple systems, if you can come up with rule set themes that organize the rule sets into the right themes, it makes it a much easier conversation. And that's what we found. So we've got the baseline, which is usually copied and amended from the Security Weaver baseline, which is delivered with the product. So that's just the rule set that feeds the segregation of duty conflicts analysis. And then we've got a number of other rule sets around data controls, whether it's organizational scope or indeed personal data or sensitive data. And then we've got one for general IT controls, which is often very useful from an audit perspective as well. So these are different lenses through which we can look at access. So let's just pick an example, P2P, and go into one of the finance system, and we're going to choose the core baseline. So this is the sort of the starting point, if you like. And we can see a number of functions which have been defined at different levels. The custom ones are the ones which start with a Z typically, and we have created, as an example, we have created custom versions for AP payment processing, which are very specific because we want to track specifically who can create a payment proposal. So just having AP payment processing can be a little broad. It's useful to know, but it's a little bit broad because it includes all the manual payments, postings, and a whole bunch of access to the vendor account type. This is a little bit more focused. And so if we were to say, well, who can execute a payment run? That's often an interesting one. We can see that we've got down here, we've got 6 users who've got the function, and they all belong to the same user group. So that gives you already get some context just by looking at those metrics. And then drilling into that, we can go and drill down typically by organization, because we don't usually go straight to the users because we might not know who they are. So we normally go down, check the organization context first, and then from there we can drill into the next level and see which users. So we get a list of the 6 users. We normally have some context, again, embedded into any listing. So wherever we show a user, we never just show the user on its own. We always provide context with the user data. That's another principle of doing this, is wherever you have the user, you just have a little bit of context around them, even if it's just, their user group or the job description or something, just makes a little bit more sense who they are, what they're doing. I mean, the principle is anyone who's got significant access or does anything of significance, we need to know exactly who they are and where they sit, what their context is. So then if we drill down further, you can then, it's only at this point when you've seen they've got this function that you think, well, how are they getting this function? And that's the only point at which the roles they have become relevant. So now you're linking their access to the function and you're saying, well, how are they getting it? Which roles are giving them access to this function? And that's where we drill down to the role piece. And again, this is all fed by the appropriate reports coming out of Separations Enforcer. And then the next level of drill down will then be just to see how the role itself is contributing to the function and getting right down to the detailed level. So the function itself is defined in terms of a combination of transaction codes and of supporting authorizations. And so the function can form a credible representation of the business capability that we're talking about. Okay, there's another switch. I'm just going to show how we switch the drill down to show the activity. And this is the level 2 activity that we're going to show here. And so in the context of payments, we're going to pick a payment executor and just show that actually we can then just check what types of transactions have they actually been executing? What types of postings have they been making? So it's one thing that they've got access to the payment execution function. It's another thing to say they've executed transaction F110 even. That would be the level 1 activity confirmation. But it's another thing to actually say what types of financial postings have they made? Have they actually performed a payment, an actual vendor payment? Or have they only done an internal payment, for example? And that can have significance. I'm going to stop there in terms of the examples, because otherwise I'll probably go down a rabbit hole. So I'm very keen to wrap up and then give you a chance to have some questions as well. So I'll just go through the benefits and just talk on the roadmap. So key benefit we had, firefighter. One of the first things we did, we reduced our average review days just by having better visibility, making some decisions. We optimized assignments. We did quite a bit of housekeeping. So that's been a big benefit, very quick benefit as well. And the firefighter information is very readily available from the tables that are there. Having the better conversations with our stakeholders, the dashboards mean conversations around access, around controls, much easier to have. You're not bogged down by some of the technical detail that we normally would be when we stick to the role and authorization conversation. A function-based conversation is much easier if it's supported by the context or organizational, etc. around that. Validation of operating model. This is a fun one because it's actually really good to actually ask the question to a process owner, who should be doing this, and then verifying and seeing who's actually doing it or who has access to do it. That's often a very good exercise. And again, the dashboard can facilitate that very easily. And then, of course, yeah, we improve our risk and compliance. We can spot things that are going wrong a lot better. Remediation is a lot safer, a lot less drama around remediation. Identifying things that are out of the ordinary is also a lot easier. But really, the heart of this is discovery. That's what this is all about. It's about discovering what's going on. And in some cases, that then allows us to monitor better. So where are we going with this? We'll just keep enhancing the analytics. But as I mentioned before, game plan is to move it towards real time, get it into BW, use SAP Analytics Cloud, but also, I know Patlock is, developing their capabilities in this area. So it'll be very interesting to align with whatever is being developed. So it's an exciting time at the moment. Where can it go? Well, automated response would be one of the possibilities. And then with AI beginning to ramp up, who knows where we could land in terms of being able to be more proactive around some of this stuff. So let me wrap up. I will just reiterate. I think, the monitoring, report, alert, check, execute, that's something we can do whether you're dealing with standard SAP or having the most sophisticated controls platform. User intelligence, that brings in analytics that then enriches whatever we're doing from a monitoring perspective. The enriching of analytics is done by creating context through the sort of data taxonomies that can give you the insight that we require and help make it easier to spot exceptions and anomalies. But most important, really, it's about making sure we have the right conversations and use the dashboards to drive some of these conversations. That's what we found most useful. It's changed the whole dynamic, the whole awareness level around some of these areas. But at the end of the day, it's all about action. These dashboards shouldn't be just great, interesting talking points and insights. They have to drive action. So it's really key to take action and also to feed back into the approach and make sure that these analytics, these insights are driving an evolution of your controls monitoring itself. And that's what we're striving to do. And then you get into this virtuous cycle, which then leads to a much better outcome. So hopefully that would have given you a flavor for user intelligence and hopefully enticed you to try out some of this for yourselves and get some of the benefits. Before I wrap up, I mentioned, I think I posed a question at the start, and I just wanted to see if you guys have had any responses. But I'm going to reveal what we have come up with, and hopefully, that'll be useful to align with what ideas you had as well. So, controls is one of the key things for protecting the value. Usability is also a key one, reporting and engagement. So on that point, I'm going to stop. Thanks for your attention, and I'm going to hand over to Stephanie.
Thank you so much, Gerald, for your presentation. Would you mind going to the next slide? We only have time for a couple questions, but I did see a few questions pop up in the chat. One question is, where do you retain this data taxonomy in Pathlock or Microsoft Excel?
That's a very good question. It started off in Excel. The game plan is that it has to find its way into SAP, and it will either be in a Pathlock table, and some of the product managers in Pathlock are looking at enabling customers to maintain their taxonomy. So I think roles, transactions, there are a number of key objects that I know the Pathlock team are definitely looking at. So that would be the ideal solution. But plan B, if that's not in place, that would be to implement it within SAP. That's what we were intending, but we would prefer to put it in Pathlock if that's available. Yeah.
Perfect. Well, that's all the time we have for questions today. If you did have some other questions, we will make sure that our team follows up with you shortly. Gerald, will you go to the next slide? We have an exciting new next presentation coming up on July 18th. This is a co-presented session with Pathlock and Cooper-Cole analysts. It's called Effective Application Access Controls in the Modern Business IT Landscape. I just put a link into the chat if you would like to go check that out and register for that, or you can go to pathlock.com and you'll see a banner with the link to register for it. I also just wanted to encourage you that we also have many more sessions coming up later today and for the next few days for the Pathlock Innovation Series. And if you would like to sign up for more sessions, I also put the link for that in the chat to go look at those sessions and sign up for some more. And with that, I just wanted to say thank you. And Gerald, will you go to the next slide? I just want to say thank you so much. And if you do have any questions, please reach out to us at info@pathlock.com. And we hope to see you at the future sessions.